The island of Saipan, deep in the Marianas Chain, had become a volcanic fortress by mid-1944. Japanese forces, under General Saito's command, transformed the mountainous terrain into a deadly maze of caves, tunnels, and cliffside bunkers. These underground networks weren't just shelters, they were command posts, supply depots, and ambush points. Every ridge concealed a firing slit, and every rock formation could be hiding a machine gun nest or a sniper with a Type 99 rifle. U.S. Marines, already battered by days of brutal fighting, realized that conventional tactics were useless in this subterranean battlefield. They needed something different, something that could reach into the darkness and destroy what was hiding there. That something came with fire. It wasn't the first time flamethrowers had been used in the Pacific, but on Saipan, the U.S. brought hell on tracks. Enter the M4A3R3 Stuart flamethrower tank, a light, maneuverable vehicle, retrofitted with a flame projector replacing its hull-mounted machine gun. Alongside it, the fearsome M4A3R3 Zippo Sherman took the field, capable of spewing thousands of gallons of napalm up to 150 feet. Their job? Clear out the caves one by one, whether by fear, flame, or both. For the Japanese troops inside, the moment they heard the roar of the tanks and the hiss of compressed flame lines, they knew what was coming. Fire would pour down the cave mouths like liquid death. There would be no mercy. One of the first documented assaults took place near the Aslito airfield, where a reinforced Japanese platoon was dug into a hillside cave complex. Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 25th Regiment, pinned down by machine gun fire and grenade traps, called forward a Zippo Sherman. The tank crawled over crushed coral and black lava rock, its hull blackened by smoke from earlier skirmishes. As it reached the cave mouth, the turret swiveled and the flamethrower arm extended forward like a serpent. Then came the inferno, a massive burst of napalm that engulfed the entire cave entrance. Screams echoed outward as the fuel splashed through the tunnel system, clinging to walls, uniforms, and skin. Within seconds, all resistance ceased. What shocked the Marines wasn't just the effectiveness of the weapon, it was the terrifying calm that followed. The flame didn't just kill, it erased. No gunfire, no screaming, no sounds of retreat, just silence and the smell of scorched earth. After each assault, they would inspect the site, finding blackened bones and melted helmets fused into stone. In one case, a Japanese officer was found seated, still clutching his katana, his body turned to ash but unmoved. These moments broke even the toughest soldiers. Some wept, others vomited. A few refused to enter the caves even after they were cleared. The psychological impact of using flame, though tactically necessary, was devastating to both sides. The Japanese High Command had drilled the idea of glorious death and honor into its troops. Surrender was shame, survival was weakness. So when the flamethrower tanks arrived, many soldiers didn't even attempt to escape. In fact, some were seen rushing toward the flame, choosing instant death over burning alive in a collapsed tunnel. Civilians, trapped or coerced, often followed. On the cliffs near Marpy Point, entire families leapt to their deaths to avoid what they thought would be torture by Americans. The truth was more complicated. The U.S. never intended to incinerate civilians, but in the fog of war, with tanks belching fire and fear spreading like smoke, perception became reality, and horror took hold. Flamethrower tanks like the M4A3R3 Zippo remained a mainstay throughout the island-hopping campaign after Saipan. Their deployment would grow more frequent and more intense, especially in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But Saipan was the turning point, the moment when fire became doctrine. It was no longer just a tool, it was policy. The terrifying image of a tank spitting napalm into darkness, lighting up night skies with orange death, became etched in the memories of every survivor. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of the end, a signal that the old ways of warfare were gone. In this new age, the enemy didn't just want to defeat you, they wanted to burn your world down. By mid-July 1944, the terrain of Saipan had been transformed into a nightmarish maze of scorched earth, shattered coral, and smoldering cave mouths. The once lush ridges were now blackened with soot, their tree lines broken by shell fire and napalm trails. Every advance was met with fanatical resistance, ambushes from spider holes, sniper fire from behind collapsed rocks, grenades thrown from hidden shafts. American forces adapted. Infantry units began coordinating tightly with Zippo tanks, calling them forward at the first sign of resistance. These tanks would roll in slowly, belching fire like dragons, lighting up ravines and tunnels that seemed to breathe death. The island had become a furnace, and the Marines were the hammers. One particularly brutal encounter occurred near the Tanapag Plain. Intelligence had revealed a dense network of Japanese fortifications within the surrounding hills, believed to house over 300 troops and ammunition stockpiles. As the 2nd Marine Division advanced, they were met with intense machine gun fire from interconnected cave positions. Standard rifle fire couldn't penetrate the rock. Grenades barely scratched the entrances. Then came the call, "Bring up the Zippos." Within minutes, 2 M4A3R3 Shermans roared into position. Supported by infantry with M1 Garands and BARs, the tanks began their assault. Fuel lines pressurized, flame nozzles aimed. What followed was a wave of heat so intense it melted the foliage and ignited oxygen within the caves. Eyewitness accounts speak of flames surging 100 feet, rolling like waves over stone and steel. Inside the caves, trapped Japanese defenders suffocated before the fire even reached them. Some attempted escape, only to be met with rifle fire from waiting Marines. Others chose to remain, covering their ears, embracing their rifles, and vanishing in a split second of light and smoke. One Marine radio operator described the smell as death soaked in gasoline. Another recalled hearing nothing but the pop of exploding ammunition and the faint roar of burning flesh. These were not clean kills. These were purges, violent, overwhelming acts of eradication. And yet, they were seen as necessary. Among the Japanese ranks, desperation began to manifest in terrifying ways. Officers ordered last-stand banzai charges from the cave exits, full sprints into flamethrower nozzles and tank barrels. Some soldiers strapped grenades to their bodies and waited for tanks to roll past. Others attempted to lure Marines into the caves with cries for help, only to trigger booby traps inside. Even civilians were pulled into the spiral. Japanese propaganda had warned them of American torture and mutilation. As tanks approached, entire families, women and children, fled toward cliffs, toward grenades, or into the infernos themselves. For many U.S. soldiers, what they witnessed in Saipan would haunt them far beyond the battlefield. On the military level, flamethrower tanks proved decisive. By the third week of operations, nearly every major cave complex had been neutralized using fire. Field reports detailed the number of gallons used, the effectiveness by terrain type, and the psychological impact on enemy behavior. Commanders praised the tanks as morale destroyers, capable not only of killing, but of shattering the will to resist. The flamethrowers altered the battlefield in ways no bullet ever could. The very sight of their long nozzles and hissing fuel tanks caused defenders to break ranks. Yet the success came at a cost. The tanks were vulnerable to mines, satchel charges, and suicide attacks. And their crews, they bore the weight of what they unleashed. Many of those who operated the flamethrowers would later speak of silence, the silence after the burn. No victory cheers, no joy, just the smell, the smoke, and the emptiness. They did what they had to do, they said, but it changed them. One tank gunner reportedly removed his flamethrower nozzle after Saipan, requesting never to fire it again. Another couldn't sleep for months, haunted by the eyes of those who burned. And yet war didn't care. Orders came, ships moved, the next island awaited. But Saipan would forever remain the place where napalm met flesh, and history recoiled. As the battle raged on into the final days of July 1944, the northern cliffs of Saipan became the last redoubt of the Japanese forces. Atop these jagged bluffs overlooking the Pacific, hundreds of surviving IJA troops, along with terrified civilians, clustered inside natural caves and hastily dug bunkers. Many of them were wounded, starving, and surrounded by the cries of children and elderly. Yet surrender was unthinkable. Japanese military code, reinforced by leaflets, radio broadcasts, and years of indoctrination, declared that capture was a fate worse than death. As Zippo Shermans moved toward these last strongholds, the defenders knew they would face flame, not negotiation. The U.S. Marines of the 4th Division began the slow, methodical process of clearing the cliffs, sector by sector. At each outcropping, engineers would check for mines, while infantry pinned down known firing positions. Once identified, M4A3R3 tanks would be summoned and moved into position with precision. One crew commander, Sergeant Eugene Ward, described the terrain as hell carved into a cliff. Zippos couldn't charge up inclines. They had to be carefully maneuvered across narrow ledges, all while under threat of suicide attacks. In one harrowing case near Marpy Point, a Japanese soldier emerged from a tunnel, sprinted directly toward the tank, and detonated a satchel charge against its tracks. The tank survived. The man didn't. Inside the caves, the psychological pressure was unbearable. As flames licked the entrances, oxygen vanished. Smoke curled deep into tunnels, forcing children and elders to gasp for air. Some civilians attempted to flee with white flags, only to be shot by Japanese soldiers enforcing the no-surrender rule. Others huddled together, praying as the roar of fire approached. Japanese officers used Type 94 pistols to execute those who tried to leave. Some families held grenades, intending to die together. Then the fire came. Napalm gushed through cave mouths like a tidal wave. Marines who stood outside swore they could hear screams beneath the earth, then nothing but the crackling of flesh. Marpy Point became the site of one of the war's most tragic spectacles. As the remaining Japanese realized the battle was lost, many began leaping from the cliffs into the sea below, a suicide en masse known today as the Bonsai Cliff tragedy. Women with children strapped to their backs hurled themselves from the rocks. Soldiers followed, often with swords drawn. All of it was witnessed by stunned Marines below, who begged them to stop, waving and shouting that surrender was possible. But the fear, stoked by years of propaganda, was too deeply rooted. The Americans, to the Japanese, were monsters. Burning tanks had only reinforced the myth. For the U.S. command, Saipan was a strategic victory. The island's capture brought B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. But for the men who fought there, it was a horror show, a slow-motion descent into madness and fire. Over 3,000 Japanese civilians and more than 27,000 soldiers died on the island, many by flame, many by their own hand. Zippo tank crews were credited with clearing over 400 fortified positions, caves, bunkers, and tunnels that no infantry alone could have survived entering. But no citation or medal could erase the images burned into their minds. The flickering orange light inside a cave, the silence after the flame, the smell that never left their uniforms. In the war's official reports, the flamethrower tanks were deemed highly effective for cave-clearing operations. A cold, efficient summary. But in private, many officers voiced unease. Was it necessary? Could there have been another way? At the time, few dared to ask. Victory came first, mercy second. And the tanks kept moving, to Tinian, to Peleliu, to Iwo Jima. The doctrine of fire had proven itself on Saipan, but it also left behind a moral scorched earth, one that many survivors, on both sides, would carry with them long after the guns fell silent.
In the final days of the battle, the island of Saipan no longer resembled a battlefield. It had become a burning crucible. The air was thick with the stench of scorched vegetation and charred flesh. Marines from the 23rd Regiment pushed through the central hills, where clusters of interconnected cave systems still held dozens of Japanese holdouts. The fire teams moved cautiously, inching forward with bayonets fixed, while engineers marked suspected cave entrances with chalk and yellow smoke. Every clearing was suspect. Every shadow was a potential ambush. In these last hellish hours, the Zippo Shermans were used with precision and cruelty. They did not simply fire, they cleansed. Napalm didn't knock on the door, it swallowed the entire room. One cave near the cliffs at Lateran Bonadero became the center of one such brutal engagement. Japanese officers had fortified the interior with sandbags, overlapping fire lanes, and even wired grenades to cave walls to trigger explosions if flame breached the entrance. A squad of Marines attempted to approach with TNT charges, but were repelled by a sudden burst of fire from inside. Moments later, a call was made, "Flamethrower support now!" A single M4A3R3 advanced under cover of suppressive fire from M1919A4 machine guns. Its nozzle extended, aimed low, and with a deep hiss, it unleashed a boiling river of napalm into the heart of the mountain. The explosion was so intense that flames surged back out of the cave entrance, followed by black smoke and a single boot. The psychological impact was unmistakable. Survivors inside the caves began firing wildly, some at their own comrades, others at shadows. In multiple instances, Japanese soldiers ran out screaming, covered in burns, only to be gunned down within seconds.
The Marines, hardened by weeks of carnage, showed no hesitation. To them, anyone coming from a cave might be holding a grenade. One flamethrower tank operator later wrote, "We didn't fire at people, we fired at holes. What came out of them wasn't always human anymore." In some areas, flamethrower bursts were followed by long silences. No gunfire, no movement, just the slow curling of smoke and the drip of melted metal. Elsewhere on the island, Japanese defenders shifted tactics in desperation. Small squads began digging lateral escape tunnels beneath the soil, hoping to flank the tanks or emerge behind advancing infantry. But flamethrower units, now experienced and coldly efficient, adapted. Sherman crews began preemptively firing into suspected tunnel lines, even when no movement was observed. Entire ridgelines were scorched, just in case. In one area south of Mount Tapochau, 6 tanks advanced in staggered formation, burning every 10 meters in what commanders called circular fire washing. The jungle canopy itself caught fire, turning green foliage into collapsing walls of flame. It was not combat, it was extermination. Despite the horror, some Japanese soldiers continued to resist with terrifying ingenuity. In one infamous instance, 2 troops, badly burned but alive, played dead outside a cave while clutching Type 97 grenades. When a flamethrower tank rolled past, they crawled beneath it and pulled the pins. The explosion killed them instantly and disabled the tank's tracks. The crew survived, barely, and never forgot the sound of metal grinding to a halt as fire licked around them. For every act of technological superiority the Americans held, the Japanese matched it with suicidal determination. It was a war not just of weapons, but of wills. Yet, even that resolve began to fade. As the tanks moved into the northernmost corners of the island, resistance melted away like flesh beneath flame. What once was organized command turned to pockets of terrified, half-starved survivors. Children emerged from holes holding sticks. Civilians wandered dazed through blackened fields. For the Marines, it was the aftermath of a storm they had unleashed with full force and with full knowledge. The flamethrower tanks parked for the final time, still hissing faintly, their nozzles glowing hot under the sun. Saipan had been taken, but something else had been lost in the process, something that no battle report would ever account for.
As the final hours of combat ticked down on Saipan, the war devolved into an act of erasure. Marines began encountering not organized resistance, but whispers of it. Sniper fire from behind tree stumps, grenades tossed from holes barely wide enough to crawl through, and booby-trapped corpses left as warnings. The Sherman Zippos were no longer used for specific objectives. They were turned loose. Hillsides were cleansed systematically, one after the other. In many areas, tanks fired into suspected positions based on nothing more than instinct. The rules had changed. It wasn't about confirmed targets anymore. It was about making sure nothing could survive beneath the ground. On the western cliffs near Punta Ajengan, a final bastion of resistance remained. The 136th Infantry Regiment, rotated in to support exhausted Marine units, faced a bizarre and tragic last stand. A series of caves had been filled with civilians, some wounded, others forced inside by retreating IJA troops. Over loudspeakers, U.S. commanders broadcast messages in Japanese, urging surrender. Some women stepped out with white cloths. Others were shot from behind by Japanese soldiers guarding the cave mouths. After 20 minutes of stalled negotiation and 2 false surrender ambushes, a single Sherman Zippo was brought forward. It hesitated for a moment, then fired. The caves lit up like furnaces. Nothing moved afterward. That same day, a medic from the 2nd Battalion found a young Japanese boy wandering near a scorched cave, his skin burned and hanging in strips. He was carrying a wooden toy and a torn piece of rice paper with kanji on it. When the medic reached him, the boy pointed back toward the smoke and whispered a single word, "Ka-san, mother." The moment was brief. The boy collapsed and died in his arms. These were not combatants. These were survivors caught in a fire meant to kill soldiers, but destined to consume anyone in its path. For many who fought on Saipan, that boy became the final image they took home. Not a flag, not a medal, but a whisper from a child burned by war. Despite all of this, the official end came not with a final battle, but with silence. On July 9th, the island was declared secure. No ceremony, no applause, just silence. The tanks stopped moving, the Marines stopped advancing, and for a long time, no one spoke. They stood among the ashes of what had once been a jungle, now reduced to charred ruins and blackened bones. Dog tags were collected, helmets stacked, flame nozzles cooled in the ocean air. The war would move on, to Tinian, to Guam, and eventually to the black sands of Iwo Jima. But Saipan had changed them, not because they had won, but because they had survived what it took to win. Flamethrower tank crews were debriefed, reports were written. Some commanders praised them as war-winning tools. Others hesitated. A few officers, quietly, asked if they could rotate out before the next island. The guilt was unspoken, but present. One report from a Marine chaplain described the Zippo crews as tired men with quiet eyes. He noted how they often sat apart during chow, how they flinched at sudden sounds, and how they never spoke of what they saw through the vision slits. They had brought hell to Saipan. Now they would carry it with them. And so ended one of the Pacific War's most controversial weapons deployments. The M4A3R3 Zippo, though devastatingly effective, was never produced in large numbers. Its role was specific, brutal, and short-lived. On Saipan, it had proven that in certain wars, technology could do what courage alone could not. But it had also proven something darker, that fire, once unleashed, does not discriminate. It burns soldiers and civilians. It destroys enemies and memories. It wins battles, and it scars nations. On the island of Saipan, the jungle never grew back in some places. But even if it had, the ghosts would still be there, quiet, smoking, and waiting.
Long after the battle had ended, the scars of Saipan remained etched not only into the landscape, but into the men who fought there. The fields where Sherman Zippos had fired napalm now stood silent, blackened craters swallowed by creeping moss, twisted metal rusting beneath Pacific rain. But for those who had gripped the flame triggers, the battlefield lived on behind their eyes. Many returned home to find that normal life no longer fit. They couldn't sleep through fireworks. They couldn't watch a campfire. Some never lit a match again. Their war had been fire, and fire follows memory like smoke. Among the local Chamorro people of the Mariana Islands, stories of the flame beasts would be passed down through generations. Children who hadn't yet been born during the battle would one day climb the cliffs and find the old cave entrances. Many collapsed, some still blackened. Elders would warn them not to go inside. That's where the island screamed, they'd say. Some survivors spoke of hearing voices in the hills at night, not ghosts in the literal sense, but memories in the wind. And perhaps they weren't wrong. On Saipan, memory is not something you recall. It's something that breathes through the trees and clings to stone. The flame tanks themselves, once seen as revolutionary, were quietly retired. The M4A3R3 was never mass-produced in large numbers after Saipan. It had done its job too well. High Command recognized its tactical effectiveness, but its moral weight was heavy. Reports leaked. Photos surfaced. Civilians burned alive by military-grade napalm became a stain on the victory. While military analysts praised high cave clearance efficiency, others began to ask whether efficiency was worth the cost. The men who had fired the napalm rarely spoke. Some refused to be interviewed. Others changed their names. You could find their medals in pawn shops, but never their testimonies in books. Years later, a single Zippo tank used on Saipan was recovered and preserved in a museum in Quantico. It sits behind a thick rope barrier, its nozzle welded shut, its exterior covered in soot that was never fully scrubbed off. Tourists walk past it, reading the plaque, maybe pausing to take a photo. But few realize what it truly did, how it sounded, what it smelled like, or what came out of the caves it fired into. In that silence, the tank remains, not just as a machine of war, but as a relic of what war asks men to become, a dragon disguised as a tool, a monument to moral combustion. For Japan, the fall of Saipan was a signal that the war was unwinnable. Tokyo now lay within range of B-29 bombers. The emperor's advisors panicked. The civilian population braced for worse, and worse did come. But for the soldiers on Saipan, the flames were enough. They never saw Hiroshima. They never saw Nagasaki. They didn't need to. They had already witnessed the limits of fire and the bottom of the human soul. In the soil of Saipan lie thousands of bones, both Japanese and American. But also burned into that ground is something else, a memory, a warning, and a silence that says everything. What began as a tactical decision to clear caves with flame ended as a moral fault line in the history of modern warfare. Saipan was not the first place to burn in the Pacific, and it would not be the last, but it was the first place where fire stopped being just a weapon and became a message, a language of fear, delivered in orange bursts and black smoke. The Japanese were right to fear the flamethrower tanks, but perhaps in the end, the ones who carried them had even more reason to be afraid of what the fire would do to others and of what it would leave behind in themselves.